Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome back to the 9th lecture on public finance, MPA405. We have gone a long way since we have moved on to the 9th lecture, and it has been very interesting having you around, even if you're not around, but imaginatively you are around. So now the 9th lecture, we would continue what we started with lecture number 8, which is public choice and the political process, and we would see how far ahead we would go. But first I would like to summarize the 8th lecture, which is in terms of few definitions. I won't go into the deeper detail like we did in lecture 8. Public choice is when decisions are made through political interaction of many persons according to pre-established rules. Now these rules can be unanimous decision, majority rule, or different types of majority rules, and we will discuss the rules later on. And then there was public choice versus private choice. Now in terms of public choice made by the there is like cost sharing is through taxes by the government, while when individuals are interacting among each other, there is voluntary cost sharing, and we discussed that in, I guess, lecture number 7, the models of voluntary agreement about different public goods and sharing of cost of public goods, where individuals voluntarily express the benefit in terms of dollar values that they derive out of the use of a specific public good. And in this lecture we continued with that, and then we moved on to the political equilibrium, which is an agreement on the level of production of one or more public goods given the specified rule of making the public choice, which we would discuss again. One of the rules we have already discussed that would come up in this summary, and the collective choice and the distribution of tax shares among the individuals. These tax shares were also termed as the tax price, and how an individual, we discussed how an individual would make the choice. He would compare the tax price or the tax share that he has to give, and then based on that he would see the marginal benefit that he derives from the use of that public good supplied by the government. This was basically surrounding around the supply of the public goods, which we were discussing. Now how an individual would choose: individual would see the quantity that of the public good that he needs to consume and his tax share, and the tax share would be actually the average cost of using that good divided by the number of the individuals. Now what he would do is, a rational individual would equate the marginal benefit to marginal cost, and he would choose exactly the quantity of the public good which would optimally utilize the tax share that he needs to pay for. And then we discussed that individuals would vote to choose that alternatives among various alternatives, and he would vote considering the benefit he derives from voting and the cost that is incurred on the voting, and the level of effect he has on that political outcome, or the benefit he would derive from that political outcome. Now there would be certain cases which we termed as rational ignorance, and in rational ignorance we discussed that individual, what would be the circumstances under which individual would not vote. The first circumstance that we discussed was that his ability to affect the outcome. Now if his ability to affect the outcome after the vote is very low, then in that sense it would be that his cost would be greater than marginal benefit he derived from voting, and he would choose not to vote. The second one would be how close the alternatives are to each other. If alternatives are very close to each other and the individual is somehow indifferent among those alternatives, or close to being indifferent, and the second alternative that he does not want to choose is very close by to the first alternative which he wants to choose, then he would rather not vote, because in that case any alternative would be of the same effect on him, or very close effect on him. Then we discuss the scenario in which the position that he needs to choose is too far from the available alternatives. In that case, since his choice, his preferred outcome is very far away, then he would choose not to vote. And the fourth one that we discussed, why an individual would not vote, would be that he has a poor information. Now, the cost of voting that we discussed was based on his visit to the poll, the time, the value of that time, and the time he consumed to gain that level of information that makes him able to choose among various alternatives. So if he has poor information, then in that case he would also choose not to vote. All these were termed as the rational ignorance, that individual would choose not to vote under these circumstances. Then we discussed the concept of majority rule for calculating an equilibrium. In that case, we started with an example in the graphical form, graphical representation of an example in which there were votes among 7 individuals, and the rule for that public choice was majority rule. Now, there were 7 individuals, A, B, C, M and F, G, H, and the voting was about that was in a community for hiring security guard for meeting their security and protection needs. Now, since security guards or hiring security guards per week is a public good, so there are positive externalities out of it. So the question would be, how much security guards should they hire? The options were from like 1 security guard per week up to 7 security guards per week. Now, in that case, how voting outcome originated was that individuals voted to the 4 security guards, which was the median outcome. Now, median outcome was individual M in that case. Now, the total amount of you can say marginal cost or average cost was $350 per security guard. Now, how that was divided was that individual tax share was 50, that was based on 350 divided by total number of 7 individuals, that is equal to 7, which is the total tax share of each individual. Based on again moving on from that, we started with the concept of importance of the median voter. We concluded that the political outcome of the majority rule or majority vote would be, using the majority rule for the public choice, would be the median voter, and his preferred outcome would be the equilibrium outcome as well. So that was mainly the importance of the median voter. Now, then based on this median voter's outcome, where M who already wanted 4 security guards, and he got that political equilibrium where 4 security guards were selected, we found out that individuals A, B and C who wanted like less than 4 security guards had to pay for 4 security guards, while individual F, G, H wanted more security guards, and in terms of their payment of $50 per as a tax share, they got less number of security guards than they wanted. So what was the output of that? The information we extracted out of that was political externality. Political externality is always when individual gets less or more than his political or optimal level of preferred outcome. So in this case specifically, individuals A, B, C had their marginal cost curve greater than marginal benefit, and whenever marginal cost curve is greater than marginal benefit, that would mean it would be better to reduce the quantity, while individual F, G, H had marginal benefit greater than marginal cost, and for them it would be better if the quantity of that public good being supplied was greater. So based on the majority rule, the optimal output came out to be 4 security guards, which neither of the two sets on the sides wanted. FGH wanted more and ABC wanted less, while the decision was based on that came out, the political equilibrium that came out of majority rule was basically based on median voters outcome, median voters preferred outcome. Then we termed this as a political externality, and we explained that if the rule for public choice is unanimous decision, then in that case political externality would be zero, because in terms of unanimous decision everyone would agree and only that outcome would be accepted on which there is agreement by everyone. Now in that example, which we also showed in tabular form, we highlighted how every individual voted in terms of their preferred outcome, and we showed that unanimous decision would be at only one security guard where everybody agreed, while on two security guard one of the individuals never agreed. So we kept this discussion on up to the point where we highlighted that unanimous decision was always good only if the political externality was the main cost of in terms of political equilibrium. But that is not the case actually. There are political transaction costs. These are costs of the time, value of the time and the effort that is spent and the processes which are gone through and the resources that are employed to get a collective decision. So those transaction costs increase with more number of individuals involved and more complex the rule is. So in case of unanimous decision, the political externality might be zero, but political transaction costs were greater. And on the other hand, if you reduce the political transaction cost, for example, on the other extreme, I highlighted in the end, I highlighted an example of a dictator in which the transaction cost is minimal because a single individual is taking the decision for everyone. But on the other hand, the political externality is at its maximum. So between these two, a rational voter needs to make a choice to weigh the cost of political externality or the transaction cost and find an optimal level. Then we also, by the end, we also discussed that representative governments, which are actually like applicable in most of the countries, is elected through democratic process in which we vote for our preferred political candidates who have a political framework or political mandate which is closer to our preferred outcomes. We vote for them and then they take the decisions based on various types of majority rules that we would be discussing in the coming lectures. So in this lecture we would be considering a unique and cyclical equilibria, which would be a very interesting scenario to discuss and go through. Now a unique political equilibrium may not emerge under majority rule. Now when there are two or more public goods, good output may receive majority vote. Now we would be discussing and we would take this, don't worry about it, because we would take this through the examples to clarify the concept. But when there are two or more alternatives and for example 3 or 4 alternatives, then the political choice methodology or the majority rule might not work and it might not result into a political equilibrium, and we would also go to the cause why that is supposed to happen and that might happen in certain cases. Now then in this case, for example, we would create an example where there are like 3 or 4 public good outputs levels at which 2 of them would result into a majority vote. So the unanimous decision or a unique political equilibrium may not emerge in that case. Now the outcome can depend on factors other than the cost versus benefits. For example, order in which alternatives are presented to each other. We would see through that example, like for example, like when two output levels are being discussed or two decisions are under discussion, then in that case the two alternatives, maybe 3 alternatives are under discussion, and how they are paired together would also affect the total outcome. And inclusion and exclusion of one alternative in the whole picture would distort the final result of the political outcome. Now that is a very disturbing scenario, because considering this, it would mean that most of the public choices that originate from the majority rule might not be the optimal outcomes, because it also depends on how those alternatives are presented and how those alternatives are put forth for voting. Because in terms of a choice, preferences need to be complete and preferences need to be transitive. So if preferred outcomes are not transitive and complete for a group of voters, then they can distort the voting mechanism. We would discuss this scenario in terms of, for example, three voters, A, B and C. Now in case of a majority rule, let us consider, for example, voters A, B and C, and there are three choices. They are given like three alternatives, and those alternatives might be, for example, for fireworks display per year. Now it is an entertainment sort of scenario in which the public good is basically an entertainment good, which is the firework displays per year, and their choices of whether to have 3 fireworks, 2 fireworks or 1 firework is being narrated in this table. Individual A's first choice is like 3 fireworks per year, his second choice is 2 fireworks per year, and his third choice is 1 firework per year. Now individual B's first choice is 1 firework per year, his second choice is 3 fireworks per year, and his third choice is 2 fireworks per year, while individual C's first choice is 2 fireworks per year, his second choice is 1 firework per year, his third choice is 3 fireworks per year. Now among these there is an individual who is choosing the 2 extremes. Now whenever, and we discussed the importance of the median voter, and we discussed that political outcomes under majority rule are successful when the dispersion is low, and the choices for the alternatives are closer to the median value. Now over here you can see that there are extreme choices, for example by one of the individuals, which we would highlight in our coming discussion. We would also see that we would name this term as multiple peaked equilibria. We can see from this table over here that individuals B's choice might affect the political outcome under the majority rule, which we would come to in a few minutes. It would be more easier to understand once we enter the graphical analysis, and you would grasp the concept immediately. Now what are single peak preferences? A unique optimal outcome exists, because single peak preferences would be like each individual has one single preferred outcome, in case of which his choices are not of the extremes, and then in that case a unique optimal outcome would exist. But what would happen if there are multi-peaked preferences? Now multi-peaked preferences, as a person moves away from their most preferred outcome, they become worse off until a certain point when moving further away from the most preferred outcome makes them better off. Now in first case, in single peak preferences, you would have a downward sloping curve, which would say, just like a case of a marginal benefit curve, for 1 unit of output you would gain the maximum benefit, and as you move further away from that outcome, your benefit would reduce and keep on reducing until you would have the least amount of benefit for the maximum amount of public good. That would be a downward sloping curve. But then in case of multiple peak preferences, an individual would prefer the two extremes. How he would prefer two extremes? Like for example, in the example of B, the individual his first preference is, for example, one firework. Then logically it should be that his second preference he is worse off than the first. If his second preference comes up as the political equilibrium, then he would be worse off because his first preference was maybe one firework. But then why it is a multiple peak? Because the further away he moves from that first choice that he gave, he would be again be better off. For example, in B's case, the further away he moves from 1, he is better off at 3 now again. So the issue is that at the two extremes, the individual is much better off than in certain central condition. So based on this, you can see the 3 graphs over here for 3 different individuals. Now these graphs show that there are like single peak for voter A. Now first let me explain the graphs. On the x-axis there is like number of fireworks per year, taking that example onwards towards graphical analysis. This is the graph of voter rankings of various alternatives. We considered 3 individuals, individual A, B and C. And we considered like 3 alternatives, that was 1 firework per year, 2 fireworks per year and 3 fireworks per year. Now the fireworks per year are displayed on the x-axis for each individuals. There are 3 different graphs being displayed on the screen. The left graph on your left would be net benefit for A, that is A's rankings of the alternatives. The second graph on the top right is B's graph, which is showing net benefits for individual B, and on the bottom graph is C's graph showing net benefit for individual C. Now what would happen over here is that if we rank these alternatives in terms of their preferences, how they gave their preferences in that table earlier, individual A has a single peak. His first choice was 3 fireworks, and his second choice was 2 fireworks, and his last choice was 1 firework. So that represents a downward sloping curve. In terms of 1 firework, that was his last choice, and he's much better off for his first preference, that is 3. Now come down to individual C. On the bottom right of the slide being displayed. Now net benefit for individual C was highest at 0.2 or maybe 2 fireworks per year. So that represents that his first choice was 2 fireworks per year, and his second choice was 1 firework per year, and his last choice was 3 fireworks per year. Now this kind of scenario also shows his first choice was second, and there is a single peak to it. Now let's come to individual B, who had multiple peaked preferences. Now in this case, his first choice would be 1 firework, then his second choice would be 3 fireworks, and his last choice would be 2 fireworks. Now you see in this graph, it is very clear that individual 3 is operating on the extremes. Like on one end he prefers 1 firework as his first preference. The logic should be the further he moves away from this preference, he should be less better off. But as he moves to the 3rd firework, he is much more better off than the 2 fireworks. Now these operating under these 2 extremes, that gives the multiple peaks, and this scenario is called multiple peak preferences. Now if we consider this, what is happening is that there is pairwise cycling phenomena, which is each outcome can win a majority depending on how it is paired for voting. We would see in a minute that pairwise cycling is basically when individuals would vote for their choices of alternatives, and their preferences automatically would be represented in their voting. When they would vote, then that would result into a political outcome in which case two of the scenarios would gain a majority, and then of course there would be a confusion. For example, in this case, on the top of this pairwise cycling slide, there is the original table in which voter A, B and C chooses between 1, 2 and 3 fireworks. Their first choice is mentioned in the second column of the top table, which is 3 for A, 1 for B and 2 for C, while the second choice is represented as 2 for A and 3 fireworks for B and 1 firework for C. And then their third choice is again represented, which is 1 firework for A, 2 fireworks for B and 3 fireworks for C. Now what if they are like, we pair these up and ask those individuals to vote for them? Now they are supposed to vote based on the choices that they have represented or we have extracted from them. Now in this example, let's consider election number 1. In election number 1, the two choices that have been put forth to these individuals is 1 display per year and 2 displays per year. Now since 2 displays per year was for example A's second choice and 1 display per year was B's first choice, so in this case individual A would choose 2 display per year, individual B would choose 1 display per year and individual C would again choose 2 displays per year because that was individual C's first choice. Now based on this, the voting outcome would say that 1 vote for 1 display per year and 2 votes for 2 displays per year, and the result is that 2 displays per year would win. Now when we change the pair, for example, we change the pair to 3 displays per year and 1 display per year. Now the result is that A would choose 3 displays per year because that was his first choice as against the 1 display per year. B would choose 1 display per year because that was his first choice, and C would choose 1 display per year because that was his second choice. So in this scenario 1 display per year would win. Now coming up again, if the option is narrated in terms of the second, if they are paired in a different alternative way, that is like 2 display per year and 3 display per year. Now this is the third election in which A would choose 3 display per year, that was his first choice. B would choose again 3 display per year because that was his second choice, his or her second choice, and C would choose 2 displays per year, that was his or her first choice. Now based on these alternatives, 3 display per years would win. Now do you see that when there was the competition or alternatives were presented grouped together in 1 and 2, 2 display per year wins, but when they are presented in 3 display per year and 1 display per year, 3 display per year wins, and when they are displays like 2 display per year and 3 display per year, 3 display per year wins. So all these represent different outcomes of the election. So the results are arbitrary and we cannot reach a political equilibrium out of this. Now so that would mean results might be order dependent, or results might be dependent on how 2 alternatives are paired together. Now that is a very arbitrary outcome of the election, and that is a very disturbing scenario. So why it is a disturbing scenario? Because there is no rhyme or reason to explain the emerging choices. That would mean that how you pair the alternatives would also matter in terms of the political outcome. That would mean that any sharp politicians or sharp you can say people who would put up alternatives, they can manipulate the results just based on individuals' rankings and just based on how they pair the choices presented to the public. Now that would mean public choices can be influenced by order in which issues are placed on the agenda, and that would mean like pairing them together like 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 3. The results were arbitrary. and arbitrary, and then elimination of one alternative out of it, or addition of one more alternative, can completely change the results. So that has a very disturbing scenario in terms of the public choice, because again, as I said, that would mean that if the pairs are manipulated and if certain alternative is taken out of the scenario, the whole political equilibrium changes. Now that would take us to Arrow's impossibility theorem. It is impossible to devise a voting rule that meets a set of conditions that guarantee a unique political equilibrium for a public choice. Now, what does that mean? Like, when voters have 3 or more distinct alternatives, options, no rank order voting system can convert the rank preferences or individuals into a community-wide ranking while also meeting a specific set of criteria. That would mean that no voting system, for example, in this sort of scenario, can convert the rank preferences of individuals into a community-wide complete and transitive rankings. That the key words are: the rankings are complete and the rankings are transitive. Rankings are complete would mean that if choice and every individual is rational and he is clear of his choices, that A is greater to B and B is greater to C, and he would follow that ranking no matter what the scenario is. And the transitive ranking would mean that if A is greater to B and for example B is greater to C, then A would also be greater to C. This is transitive ranking. So in this scenario, we saw that when voters have 3 or more distinct alternatives, a few options available, no rank order voting system, which we took as an example, can convert the rank preferences of individuals into complete and transitive rankings while also meeting a specific set of criteria. Now, what would that criteria be in terms of which we are talking about? That criteria are called unrestricted domain, or non-dictatorship, or Pareto efficiency, and independence of irrelevant alternatives. We can express that criteria in terms of these conditions for Arrow's impossibility theorem. Now, Arrow actually won a Nobel Prize based on his analysis of the public choice. All voters have free choice, and there is no dictatorship or no control or no pressure on any voter. Unique political outcome is obtained. We cannot rule out multiple peak preferences. So if any of these two, if we give free choices to the individuals, then Arrow says that it would be impossible to reach a political outcome in which individuals would be ranking those preferences in a complete and transitive manner. Then secondly, we say that if we also consider multiple peaked equilibria, which multiple peak preferences, then in that case this is actually the multiple peak preferences that resulted into those arbitrary results, which we will see later on. So in the presence of multiple peaked preferences, it would be impossible to reach to a political outcome in which individuals would rank their preferences complete and transitive manner. If all voters change their ranking of a particular alternative, but the public choice that emerges must not move in the opposite direction. So if the rankings are changed, the public choice that has been made should not move completely in the opposite direction. Public choice must not be influenced by order in which they are presented. Now, if the public choice is influenced by the order in which they are presented, just like the example we saw earlier, that would automatically mean that it is impossible to reach to an outcome in which individuals rank their preferences in complete and transitive manner. Now, public choices must not be affected by elimination or addition of an alternative to the ballot. Now, that would exactly be the example which we discussed. If we take out any one of the alternatives presented to the individuals, then they rank those preferences, then in that case they would reach to an optimal level. But once these 3 alternatives were ranked by individual preferences, specifically in the presence of multi-peaked preferences, that resulted into an impossibility of an outcome. public choices should be transitive. Now if public choices are transitive, specifically in case of B, the public choice did not seem to be transitive because B preferred two extremes, and as per his choice, the choice number, for example, 1 firework was greater than 2 firework. In that case, 1 firework and 2 firework was 3 firework were greater than 2 firework. Now those preferences are not transitive as such. What would be the cause of those cycling multiple peak equilibria? Cycling would mean repetition of the same choices again and again and same voting order, but the result would be arbitrary. Now in that case, what would be the cause of the cycling phenomena basically? Now basically the cause of cycling phenomena was multi-peak preferences of the individual B, as I highlighted earlier. I hope you understand the concept of multiple peaked equilibrium and Arrow's impossibility theorem. I would go through these slides again once during the summary and at end of this lecture. So I wish to again imprint the concepts on your mind, because as I have highlighted again and again, the concepts are more important than just in fact the students who intend to grasp concepts rather than just wishing to pass the course show a better result, because they have a multi-dimensional thought process and they consider those concepts in terms of various scenarios. So it is very important for you to grasp these concepts right here and right now. I would repeat the previous slides in the summary so you can actually grasp the concept. Now, voter ranking for firework displays per year, all voters with single peaked equilibrium. What we did in this scenario is the individual B was the individual with multiple peaked preferences. If we eliminate that out of the scenario and we take individual B to be a person with single peak preferences, then this would be a table representing his preferences. His preferences has been changed from 1, 3 and 2 to 1, 2 and 3. In previous example, he was considering the two extremes. On his first choice was 1 and his third choice was 2, and that was the two extremes, and his second choice was 3. But in this example, we have created another individual B over here, whose first choice is 1 firework display per year, his second choice is 2 firework display per year, and his third firework is 3 displays per year. If we put them into a graphical form, that would be easier to understand. You see the graphs of net benefit for A is the same. It is upward sloping. His first choice is 1 and his first choice is 3 and his third choice is 1, and it represents a single peak. Now on the bottom right is net benefit for C, which is again a single peak. His first preference is 2 firework per week, and his second preference is 1 firework per week, and his third preference is sorry, not firework per week but fireworks per year, because per week fireworks would be very, very expensive, and his third preference is 3 fireworks per year. Now going to net benefit for the new B individual we have created over here, we have eliminated his multiple peaked equilibria, multiple peak preferences. In this case, the individual first preference is 1 firework per year, his second preference is 2 fireworks per year, and his third fireworks is 3 third preference is 3 fireworks per year. Previously his graph had 2 multiple peaks, but in this case it has 1 single peak. Now if we take them on in terms of pairwise voting, and we see whether the cycling phenomena still exists, on the first election we put up for example 1 display per year, 1 firework display, and 2 firework display per year, and ask the 3 individuals to vote for them. Now since the existing votes of A and C would remain the same because their preferences have not changed up till now. The only change would be in case of the individual B, the new individual B, whose preferences are now single peaked rather than multiple peaked. Now in this case specifically, the first election, individual B would choose one display per year because that is his first choice. Now one display per year receives one vote and two display per year receives two votes, so the outcome of this election would be two displays per year. Now moving on, we would now we pair three displays per year and one display per year. In this case, individual A would choose three displays per year, and individual B, the new individual B, whose preferences are now single peaked, and individual C would choose one display per year because it is first choice for individual B and it is like second choice for individual C. So in the end, like one display per year wins this, and the result is one display per year. Now if we look at the previous election 1, the result was two display per year was the winning, and election 2, it is one display per year which wins. In terms of election 3, we put up two options together, which is two displays per year and three displays per year. In case of two displays per year, the new individual B would choose two display per year because that is his second choice, while three display per year is his third choice, while individual C would prefer two displays per year because that is his first choice, and three displays per year is his third choice. Individual A would be choosing three displays per year, that is his first choice. Now two displays per year wins. Now you see, just by eliminating multiple peaked scenario, we came up to a location where two firework displays were selected based on the majority rule. Now the same tabular example is presented in a graphical form over here, where all the three individuals are having a single peaked preference. On the x-axis there are firework displays per year, which is 1, 2 and 3, and on y-axis there are net benefits derived by each individual on in terms of the fireworks. The peak for voter A is represented by the line which starts from 1 to goes to 2 and then 3 fireworks per year. In case of voter B, now since he is with a single peak preference, he starts with one firework per year, that is his first choice, goes to second firework per year, that is his second choice, and then goes down to 3 fireworks per year, that is his third choice. And individual C, who prefers 2 fireworks per year as his first choice, while his 1 firework per year is his second choice and 3 fireworks per year is his third choice, is sort of a triangle without the base over here, but the main point is that he is representing a single peak preference. Now out of these 3 choices that each individual were presented, and based on the pairwise voting, they came to a total of 2 fireworks per year, and that represents, just by eliminating the multiple peak preferences, the individuals who prefer extremes rather than central condition, or whose preferences would be, as his moves away from his first choice, he is worst off, but further he moves away from his first choice, he is better off again. So if we eliminate that sort of scenario, then we can reach to a political equilibrium under the majority rule. Now, multiple peak preferences are actually inconsistent with the declining marginal benefit concept, because the declining marginal benefit concept represents that the marginal benefits for gaining one more public good would be less than the marginal benefit you get from would be previous use of the public good. Now, declining marginal benefit of pure public good, meaning that preferences are single peaked, is represented by this graph over here. There are two panels in the graph, the top panel and the bottom panel. The bottom panel, we should focus on that first. On the x-axis of both of these panels, there is output of a pure public good, while on the y-axis on the bottom panel there is marginal benefit and tax per unit, while on the top panel there is net benefit. Now, marginal benefit is a downward sloping curve which represents that as individual consumes more of the pure public good, his marginal benefit derived from the next unit is less than what he achieved from the first unit. So, marginal benefit is a downward sloping curve. Then there is tax per unit, which is the tax share of the individual, or the tax price, which we discussed in the previous lecture. The tax price actually represented that average cost divided by total number of individuals, which is actually the cost of providing that pure public good. Now, the point where marginal benefit intersects the tax per unit or the tax share is the optimal amount of output for a given individual. Now, that would be represented by Q star over here. That would be the optimal amount, because before that point, the marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, which is represented by T over here, which we have discussed time and again, that when marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, it would be better to increase the quantity of the public good, and when marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit, it would be better to reduce the quantity of that public good. So same scenario is taking place over here in this graph, and the top panel shows the net benefit. Net benefit is the marginal benefit minus marginal cost. So as long as marginal benefit on the lower panel is above the marginal or the tax share, the net benefit is increasing. So at the point where marginal benefit intersects the tax share, the net benefit is at its maximum, or net benefit is at its peak. Now, as soon as marginal benefit is below the tax rate or tax per unit or the tax price, it would pay to reduce the quantity, and the net benefit starts to decline, and now it is downward sloping. Now, multiple peak preferences, as I said, are inconsistent with the declining marginal benefit, but they do exist in real life, and there are examples to it also. For example, public versus private schooling budgets is also an issue which can be discussed to show the individuals have multiple peak preferences. For example, now there are certain alternatives, and let's assume an individual would prefer to send his children to private schools, considering that his children would be better educated, or maybe his consideration that private schools are having a better quality education. Now, when he would cast his vote for the tax being levied, that would fund the public schooling, he would opt for like a lower tax level, because he is planning to send his children to private school, and in that case he would be opting for a lower tax alternative, since he do not want to pay for the facility that he does not want to use. Now, he is sending his children, again I put your focus on that he is sending his children to private schooling, and he has opted to to educate his children in private schooling system. So he would opt for a lower tax rates, because then in that case he would consider that less budget should be allocated to public schools. Now, based on that, I would join this point together. I need to see that example again. Now, this in this example, what we would expect as an outcome would be that he is not paying for, he is opting for a lower budget for public schools because he is not getting a benefit out of it. His marginal benefit is not affected by the amount of budget allocated to public schools, because in terms of taxes he would pay a higher, he would have to pay a higher amount if higher quality of public schooling is opted for. Now, what we would expect over here, that only moderate quality of public schooling would be opted for, and in that case he would be taxed at a moderate level. Now, once he is taxed at a moderate level, he would be, for example, given his personal budget for private schooling. He won't be able to afford that. That would diminish his personal budget for private schooling. So again, he would opt for he would then he would very well allow higher budget for public schooling. You see, now there are like two extremes that an individual is going for. In case of first scenario, he is opting for lower budget for public schooling because he is planning to send his children to a private school, while on the other hand, when he is considering the moderate schooling level, that reduces his budget in for private schooling of his children. He is going to opt for a higher budget for public schooling, so that now he is sending his children to public schools and he wants a better quality education over there. Now, this is multiple peak preferences in terms of public and private schooling and in terms of a real life scenario. Now, in this case, the individual is opting for two extremes. On one hand, he is opting for low budget for public schools because he thinks he's not being affected by it. On the other hand, when there is moderate taxation, he is considering sending his children to public schools because now he no more affords, he cannot afford private schools expenses. So in that case, he is opting for high level of budget allocated to. So his first choice would be, for example, low budget. Then his second choice would be high budget allocation, considering the moderate taxation and considering that he won't be able to afford private schooling. And his third choice would be moderate level of budget. So there is a multiple peaked equilibria over multiple peak preferences over here. Then so was the case with in case of Vietnam War. When in USA, people were considering that on first alternative, people were considering that we should not go for war, but if we do go for war, then it should be an all-out war, in which case we should like ensure that there is success to that war. So again, these are two extreme alternatives: either zero expenses for war, or zero budget allocation, or zero votes for going on the Vietnam War. And then the other extreme, that if we are going for the war, then we should go like at the maximum level. That would include like an all-out invasion and taking control of the country and taking all the resources and that we can employ for that. So these are again two extremes which represents multiple peak preferences of the individuals, and which are no doubt inconsistent with the marginal benefit, but these are real life scenarios, and these multiple peak preferences would always cause an Arrow's impossibility theorem, in which it would be very difficult to rank, to make a ranking under any rule, make a ranking of which would be complete and transitive on a community-wide level. Now, in the next part of this lecture, we would come to the political process. In the political process, there are three main areas that we need to discuss. There is constitution, and there is minority rule, and there is majority rule. First, we would discuss them one by one in order to have a better understanding. Now, what is a constitution basically? Constitution is an accepted set of rules by which decisions are made, by which whenever there are like different choices of or few alternatives, then the constitution provides with a set of rules through which each alternative or a set of alternatives is to be evaluated. Now, these constitutions evolve over time, and they are generally accepted across the community. Some decisions might require rules, some does not. For example, choices of what you wear today or tomorrow might not require a rule, but when there is a choice of whether to go on war or not to go on war, like we were discussing, like Vietnam War, then there are rules that are required to be made. Now, since the constitutions evolve over time and are generally accepted by the public, so it is generally assumed that viable constitutions have social contracts inherent in their rules. So that would mean that they have they are generally accepted by the public or the citizens of the country, and those rules, the rules that exist in the constitution that are required to be used for choices among various alternatives have social contracts inherent in themselves. Now, how would these social contracts and rules are inherent in the constitution is basically it is the uncertainty of the level of skills of each individual and uncertainty of the future opportunities. Now, when I'm comparing my level of skills with someone else's levels of skills, then there is an uncertainty that how skillful the two individuals are, and based on those skills, what would be our future opportunities. So if there is a while of ignorance, if there is, that's actually the word that is most appropriate for it, if there is a while of ignorance and then you are not sure about what would happen tomorrow, then to create a specific set of rules and to enter into a social contract would be the best possible opportunity that I would have, and that would ensure that whatever the future opportunities might be, I would be safe in terms of the social contract I have executed. And these social contracts are inherent in the rules through which various alternatives are evaluated, and these rules are these rules of decision are included in the constitution of a country. Now, there are certain types of rules which are used in political processes. We would mainly discuss broadly two types of rules over here. There are minority rules and there are majority rules. Minority rules are the ones which might not satisfy majority of the community, and those types of rules are minority rules. Now, whenever like few smaller group of individuals are taking decisions for a broader group of individuals, then that would be a minority rule, and majority of the community might not be satisfied by those types of rules. And when there is a smaller group of individuals consistently taking decisions for majority of the population, then that kind of a scenario is called oligarch. And one if one single individual is taking decisions for all the community, then that would be the one extreme of minority rule, and that would be the dictatorship, and that is called monarchy. Now, and then there is another extreme of for example minority rule, which is, for example, there is no involvement of the population in any sort of decision making in the country or in that community. And that would be, the examples would be, for example, the colonial rule. During colonial rules, the citizens of the country had no involvement in the decision making process, and the decisions were taken elsewhere in some other countries. Now, these kind of minority rules, as we discussed in terms of political externality, externality and in terms of transaction cost. Political externality are the cases where the preferred outcome of the individuals are far away from the equilibrium, political equilibrium, and the result is dissatisfaction. Greater the political externality has costs of themselves, and the cost is in terms of dissatisfaction of the individuals involved. So in all of these three cases, whether it is oligarchy or monarchy or for example colonial rule, the individuals who are involved are not satisfied with the decisions because their involvement is minimal in that decision making process, and their preferred outcome is very far away from the equilibrium outcome. So in that case it might create more political externality. On the other hand, the transaction costs which we discussed earlier are lower in terms of because transaction costs are the value and resources that are employed to reach a political equilibrium. So in this case, since a few individuals or one single individual or an external entity is taking the decisions for the community or the economy or the country, so in this case the transaction cost would be very low. Now then there is a majority rule. Simple majority rule was the case which we discussed in the earlier process, in which 51% of the individuals voting would represent that the alternative is chosen, or the decision of the political decision or the political outcome would be based on 51% of the individuals. This is the simple majority rule. In our example, for like 7 individuals choosing for an outcome or a choice of a public good, when 4 out of 3 individuals voted for one alternative, for example the choice of the security guard, 4 security guards were selected, as long as 4 out of 7 individuals were choosing to opted yes for that security guard, and as soon as the option changes, like for example when 4 individuals opted no for having more security guards and only 3 individuals opted yes for hiring more security guards, then under that majority rule the decision was taken. Then there are other majority rules. Now for example, 2/3 majority rule would represent that 2/3 of the individuals would need to vote yes for an alternative to be accepted. Now you see, like in case of simple majority rule, 51% of the individuals are saying let's assume that the choice is again between having more security guards or not. So in that case, if 51% of the individuals, that would be like 4 out of 7 individuals would choose to hire a security guard, the security guard would be hired. But in that case, apart from the political externality generated across the board, apart from that 49% of the individuals would be dissatisfied. But then if you increase the majority, which we discussed earlier, with increase in the majority rule, for example to 2/3 of the individuals, in that case it would automatically be number of dissatisfied voters would decline to only 33%. There are costs and benefits of this political process, minority rule, majority rule, and following the political process to evaluate the outcomes. Now we better take that to like the next part or maybe the next lecture. What I would do is over here is I would quickly go through all these important topics which we have discussed, because these were, I understand, that somewhat difficult to understand at certain level. So we would repeat those, and this repetition would at least imprint the concepts in your minds, and that would help you in better understanding the implications involved. We started with the public choice, which is when decisions are made through political interaction of many persons according to pre-established rules, and now we are discussing those pre-established rules. Now what is a political equilibrium? Is an agreement on the level of production of one or more public good given the specified rule for making the collective choice and distribution of tax shares among individuals. Now these political equilibrium would decide what would would be the efficient outcome, for whether to change the level of production of one or more public goods given the specified rule that we use, minority rule, majority rule, and there would be certain rules within majority rule, for example 51% simple majority rule or 2/3 of the majority, and we would discuss those again. And the distribution of tax shares among the individuals. Now these are the choices that these are the outcomes of the political equilibrium. We were discussing a unique and cyclical equilibria. Now uniqueness of a political equilibrium may not emerge under the majority rule. Why? We discussed that very specifically with an example. I hope you would be better able to understand that in certain cases majority vote, when there are 2 or 3 alternatives involved, the majority vote might not result into a political equilibria. The outcome can depend on factors other than cost versus benefits. Because it was only cost versus benefits, then the equilibria would be very simple. But then it also involves how individuals rank their preferences and how individuals choose among the alternatives. In that case, the order in which alternatives are presented and inclusion and exclusion of certain alternatives also affect the uniqueness of political equilibrium. And in fact, there would be no unanimous decision or no specific decision under the majority rule. And for this, we considered an example where there were 3 individuals who were choosing for a display of fireworks. Now, display of fireworks per year, number of displays of fireworks per year was being treated as a public good over here. Now the table over here represented their choices, and we also discussed using this graph and defined those terminologies before, that there are 2 types of rankings. One is single peak and the other one is multiple peak. Now single peak ranking is the one in which there is one single choice that would come out for an individual, and his rankings would be very clearly defined, while multiple peak reference rankings would be the case where an individual would be better off at 2 extremes, and for example, as he would move away from his first choice, he would not be better off, but as he moves further away from his first choice, he would be much more better off. So we tried to show a voting system and pairwise cycling, which is a phenomena in which each outcome can win a majority depending upon how it is paired. So for these 3 alternatives, 1, 2 and 3 displays of firework per year, we conducted a voting based on individuals' preferences, which are shown on the top table, while the bottom table represents the election outcome. And based on their outcome, it was shown that the results were arbitrary, and there were, in first election there were 2 displays per year, in second election there were 1 display per year, and the third election selected 3 display per year. So there is no specific outcome, and the results are order dependent, and any result can emerge as a winner, and which is the phenomena of cycling. And it was very disturbing. Why? Because public choices now can be, our new view shows that public choices can also be influenced by order in which issues are placed on the agenda, as well as elimination of one alternative can change the ranking of other alternatives. So why this takes place, and we pointed it out to be the multiple peak preferences as the cause of this scenario. Then moving on, we discussed the Arrow's impossibility theorem, a very interesting narration of what we discussed earlier. It is impossible to devise a voting rule that meets a set of conditions that can guarantee a unique political equilibrium for a public choice. Now, what is that set of conditions that are to be guaranteed? And in the presence of those set of conditions, which are called our Pareto efficiency, non-dictatorship, independence of alternative conditions, what are these conditions under which no political outcome can be used using a voting rule. Now these set of conditions would be: all voters have free choice, unique political equilibria is obtained, we in the presence of multiple peaked equilibria. If all voters change their rankings of a particular alternative, the public choice emerges must not deviate in the opposite direction. Public choice must not be influenced by order in which they are presented. Public choice must not be affected by elimination or addition of an alternative, and public choice should be transitive. Now in presence of all these conditions, it would be if we meet all these conditions, it would be impossible to reach to a public choice using a voting mechanism. Now we pointed out the cause of this cycling phenomena, and why cyclical pairwise cycling resulted into an arbitrary result. So we treated multiple peaked equilibria as the cause, and the individual B who showed a multiple peaked preferences, we took that out of it, and we included another individual as B star who or B slash who showed a single peaked preference. Now in the presence of this single peak preference, we did the pairwise cycling again, and in the first election there were 2 displays per year. In the second election there was 1 display per year when we compared 3 and 1 display per year, and we asked them to vote. But in the third case it was again 2 display per year, in which case the choices were 2 and 3 displays per year. Now this showed that elimination of a multiple peaked equilibria, multiple peak preference resulted into a median peak as the political equilibrium under majority rule. So now when we eliminated the multiple peak preference, we came up to a political equilibrium which was not possible before in the presence of that multiple peak preference, which again strengthens the arrow's impossibility theorem, because in presence of that multiple peak we were not able to reach to an equilibrium. Then why multiple equilibrium is against basically the declining marginal benefit, which we have been focusing on in this course. Declining marginal benefit results from the fact that more good and more of a public good an individual uses, his marginal benefit derived out of that public good reduces. Now this graph over here in its bottom and top panel represents that why marginal benefit is downward sloping, and that downward sloping represents that his net benefit increases in the start and decreases later on, and at the point of equilibrium it is maximum. So the multiple peak equilibria actually is opposite of this declining marginal benefit of a public good. Now, but still the point is that this multiple peak equilibria does exist in terms of in real life actually, which we proved through an example of public versus private schooling budgets and Vietnam War. I would again narrate the public and versus private schooling budget example. If an individual has a choice, for example, to choose for a budget for a public school, because more budget allocated would improve the quality of education in the public school, and his preference is to educate his children in a private school. Now as a first choice he would opt for low budget for public school, because he has planned to educate his children in private school. But in terms of if moderate budget is selected for the public school, in that case the tax burden on the individual would reduce his finances for educating his children in the private school, and that would result into a multiple peak preference, because in this case he would choose higher budget for public schools. And you see in real life example the multiple peak preferences are do take place, which was proven through these 2 examples. And then we discussed the fourth part of this running topic in the lectures, which is we discussed the constitutions, we discussed the minority rules, and we discussed the majority rule under the political process. Now constitutions are accepted set of rules by which decisions are made they evolve over time and they are generally accepted. Now the main thing is that these viable constitutions have social contracts inherent in their rules. Now how these are inherent in their rules? Because of uncertainty of my set of skills that I have and the future opportunities I would get. Now since that is behind a veil, in fact a veil of ignorance beyond which I cannot see, I cannot perceive the future, so it would be much beneficial and I would be quick to enter a social contract, and those set of social contracts create rules, and those rules constitute the constitution, which is basically an accepted set of rules, the rules which are generally accepted across the community for decision making. Then we discuss the minority rules, which might not satisfy majority of the community. Minority rules like, for example, some smaller set of individuals in terms of an oligarch making all the decisions for the larger community, or for example a dictator taking decisions for the most of the community, or for example a colonial ruler taking decisions for their colony when that colony has no involvement in decision making. So that sort of decision making generates a political externality to a greater extent, and most of the citizens or majority of the citizens are dissatisfied with the results because they are not involved in the decision making process and they are further away from their preferred outcome, and the result is a political externality. Then we discuss the majority rule in terms of political process, which is a simple majority rule of 51%, which we have used in the examples we have discussed in this course and then up till now, and then we in this lecture in fact, and then we also considered a 2/3 majority rule, which is actually applicable in Pakistan's parliament. With the 2/3 majority rule, the greater the number of people or voters you involve as a rule for the political equilibrium, the less number of dissatisfaction you get. So if you use 2/3, number of dissatisfied voters declines to 33% as against the simple majority rule of 51%, in which case we saw in our example of that selection of security guards, and when people voted, when 7 individuals voted for it, the result was a median solution, and 49% of the individuals were dissatisfied, considering that their marginal benefit was either above the marginal cost or their marginal cost was above marginal benefit, and only median voter got the optimal outcome of his, you can say, his preferred outcome. This I would end today's lecture over here, and we would continue with the next lecture, and we would continue this topic, and I hope you would be revising the books I have offered. In fact, I have recommended so that you can have better understanding of the subject of public finance, which would be very useful for your future. Thank you and see you soon.